James O'Keefe's most recent undercover expose at a New York testing facility for the My Coronavirus. It's a good example of why asking suggestive questions to improper witnesses in contextually ambiguous circumstances doesn't always help build your case. Viva Frei, macho litigator turned YouTuber, and if you are new to my channel and you don't know what the My Coronavirus is, well, it rhymes with something that you're not allowed saying on YouTube these days because they automatically demonetize your video, even if there's nothing remotely advertised or unfriendly in that video. A number of people have suggested a number of other nicknames, but I like My Coronavirus. So, what are we talking about today? James O'Keefe, Project Veritas. If you don't know who he is or what his channel is, well, I don't know, you must be living under a rock because he is an undercover investigative journalist, and he, generally speaking, does very good work. They do very good work, and I think that they are exponentially more reliable than mainstream media as a whole. I have in fact done a couple of vlogs on James O'Keefe and Project Veritas. I'll link a short playlist of those videos right here. Give them a watch if you have yet to see them. Now, if you happen to be one of the people who does not like James O'Keefe or Project Veritas and you take issue with me calling them more reliable, you are entitled to your opinion and I respect it. When I call them more reliable, it is only insofar as they have had to make less retractions or corrections than standard mainstream media. But the fact that I may like them and respect them does not mean that I'm not going to call them out or at least share my opinion when I think that they've put out an expose that doesn't actually prove that which they think it has proven. And that is, in fact, in my humble opinion, the case with their most recent expose where James O'Keefe goes to get tested for the My Coronavirus at a New York testing facility. If you haven't seen that video yet, go give it a watch. I'm going to link it right here. It's slightly over 9 minutes, which means it's slightly over 6 minutes if you play it back at 1.5 speed.
What about the situation itself? Is it as bad as ever the media is saying, the whole pandemic?
Oh, no, it's the flu.
It's just the flu?
It's the flu.
That's all it is?
It's the flu.
Wow.
But in a nutshell, the long and short, or the 30,000-foot overview of that video is that the media is hyping up the My Coronavirus. It's not as bad as the media is playing it out to be, etc., etc. And this is the interesting thing with forced objectivity or impartiality. One can in fact agree with that thesis, but nonetheless look at the video and say it does not in fact prove that thesis. In my humble opinion, and with the utmost of respect for James O'Keefe and the Project Veritas enterprise, I don't think they proved what they sought out to prove with that video. Bringing things back to law because that is the purpose of my channel, I think James O'Keefe's video in fact shows why it doesn't necessarily build your case to ask highly suggestive questions to inappropriate witnesses in contextually ambiguous situations. But let's look at the highlight sections of James O'Keefe's video in order to make that point.
What do you think? Is this as bad as everyone's saying out here? Or should I trust the media?
So, it's quick. I mean, for the kids, it's bad. It's just they're going to stick up like a Q-tip up your nose. I heard it's like a weird feeling. It's not like bad. Like, you ever got when you get strep throat, you put something in
Yeah.
your throat?
Well, what about the situation itself? Is it as bad as ever the media is saying, the whole pandemic?
Oh, no, it's the flu.
It's just the flu?
It's the flu.
That's all it is?
It's the flu.
Wow, it's not as bad as the CNN is telling me?
Everybody differently.
Is it as bad as Andrew Cuomo is telling me? And is it as bad as Andrew Cuomo is saying on CNN?
I don't know.
It's just a flu, though, basically.
It affects everybody differently.
Okay.
Yeah. So pretty much, like you got symptoms, I might, or other people don't have. The problem is that it spreads quick, like the flu, like a cold.
Are you guys like Army National Guard, or what are you guys?
Yeah, it's the Army.
If we are looking at this like a lawyer trying to build their case, we know what James O'Keefe is after here. He wants to prove that the media is hyping this thing up and the situation is not as bad as they say it is. Alright, that is the objective, but who is the witness that he is now using to prove that point?
You're in the Army?
Yeah, from New York.
Where are you from?
Brooklyn.
Well, thanks for being here.
He is not asking questions to a doctor or an expert at a treatment facility, he is asking questions to a National Guardsman at a testing facility. And right from the get-go, you can see that there is a little bit of difficulty effectively communicating through the window. James O'Keefe first asks if the situation is as bad as everybody says it is, and the National Guardsman is thinking that he's asking about the test itself. And the National Guardsman answers with that understanding of the context in mind, and James O'Keefe then moves on to no, not the test itself, but the whole pandemic situation. But understanding the context or the mental framework in which the National Guardsman is answering the questions, it's clear that that person is in the frame of mind of the testing, not the treatment. Not only that, but the National Guardsman is not there to make everybody nervous who's showing up for a test. The National Guardsman is not there to make people panic, so naturally if anybody asks him a question, he's going to try to downplay the situation, say, yeah, it's fine, go get your test, and go home and don't panic. And so James O'Keefe proceeds to ask him highly suggestive questions of things that, at the very least from the context, we do not know that he has any first-hand knowledge of. Having knowledge of what goes on at a testing facility is far different than having knowledge of what goes on at a treatment facility. James O'Keefe seems to be a very sincere person with very sincere objectives, but he is asking asking suggestive questions to someone who is also there only to please. And so naturally, this National Guardsman is going to be inclined to agree with the suggestions coming from James O'Keefe. It's human nature, it's almost responsible conduct, because you wouldn't want a National Guardsman telling someone who's showing up for testing that the situation is out of control. So even if one agrees with James O'Keefe's thesis, this evidence does not support that thesis. And this sort of goes back to the fundamental distinction in law of the difference between an expert witness and a witness of fact. If you ask a witness of fact his or her opinion, there's going to be an objection because witnesses of fact are not there to give their opinions. And with all due respect to the National Guardsman, I have no doubt that he has first-hand knowledge of what's happening on the ground at the testing facility. He is not an expert witness. And James O'Keefe is asking him questions of opinion.
I'm in the fence with you with them. I'm doing all this.
You're doing everything.
Yeah, and I'm not getting sick. I'm good.
And these suggestive questions illustrate the ambiguity of the context. James O'Keefe suggesting that the situation is not as bad as everybody says it is, and this guy says, yeah, I'm in the tent doing all the work myself, I'm not getting sick. In the mind of James O'Keefe, he's asking a question about the pandemic as a whole, and in the mind of the National Guardsman, he is answering the question only from the perspective of administering the tests in that tent. So not only does it not make evidence of the thesis of the video, relying on it as though it does sort of undermines the argument. In the exact same way, it would compromise your case if you were to be in front of a judge and started asking witnesses of fact highly specified questions of opinion. It would not take more than one or two questions for opposing counsel to object on the basis that you're asking questions of opinion to a witness of fact. And even if opposing counsel happened to have fallen asleep, the judge would intervene and say, why on earth are you treating this witness of fact like an expert witness? The judge might even say, I don't care about this person's opinion. They can give you their opinion until the cows come home. They are not here to give you their expert opinions because they are not experts. The judge might even say, okay, I've heard their opinion. It's worth what it's worth, and I'm going to give it the weight that I think it's worth. But now it's time to move on, maître. Maître is actually master. It's the French word for what we call attorneys in Quebec. I'm speaking with these army guys, and they're basically just telling me it's a bad flu. Okay, it is not to demean or undermine these army guys, and in fact, they're entitled to their own opinions in any event. But when it comes to a matter of opinion on the severity of an illness, the question is going to be whose opinion would carry more weight, that of an army guy or that of a doctor or an expert? The opinion of an army guy administering the tests for the virus or the opinion of a doctor or an expert treating the virus? If you ask for the opinion of an unqualified expert, and I'm putting expert in quotes because if they're unqualified, they are not experts, you're going to get the opinion of an unqualified expert. And if you think that the opinion of an unqualified expert is going to prove your case, you've got another thing coming.
Is it as bad as they're saying? This pandemic, everyone's freaking out. Is it bad? Is it overblown by the media? What is it like?
Is it what?
Is the media accurately reporting, or is it as bad as people are saying?
No.
It's not as bad as the media is making it out bigger. Wow.
They just want to be precautious.
Just be precautious. Yep. All right.
Again, not to repeat myself, it's not even clear that the person on the other side of the window can hear the questions. And the follow-up questions are so suggestive that any judge on earth would throw those questions out if it were a court of law. If we are thinking like a lawyer, and by that I mean thinking analytically and not thinking exploitively or how to screw somebody, you might even think that the people have an incentive to mislead the person in the car. Somebody showing up for the My Sharona Cyrus asking a ton of questions, you want to pacify them even if you have to lie to them. Which actually reminds me of a funny story. When I was younger, I was going for a gastroscopy or an endoscopy, I forget which one, but the one that goes down your mouth. And I started asking the doctor all sorts of questions like, oh, what are the chances of perforating my intestines, etc., etc. And at one point, I remember it clear as day, the doctor puts his pen down on the table and says, you know what, I'm not comfortable doing this procedure on you anymore. And my mother goes, what do you mean you're not comfortable doing the procedure on him anymore? And he says, your son's asking a lot of questions, your father's a lawyer, I don't want to do this procedure on you guys anymore. True story, that doctor was in a position where he saw a patient asking a lot of questions, knew the father was a lawyer, and didn't want to get involved in the situation at all. In this case, we have someone showing up for the My Sharona Cyrus test, asking a bunch of questions. A responsible person on the other side of that window is not going to make that person more nervous. And so the answers that person gives to highly suggestive questions from what appears to be a nervous person, they might not be an indication of the truthfulness of those answers. They might actually be an indication of the intent to mislead, if only for the purposes of pacifying the concerns of that person. So that is my insight into this expose as viewed through the eyes of an analytically thinking lawyer. I don't necessarily think this compromises the James O'Keefe Project Veritas brand. I just don't think it proves that which they think or wanted it to prove. And if I were grading this project, I might give it a 6 or a 7 on 10 just because I don't think the evidence was there to prove the thesis. Even if you agree with James O'Keefe's position, the evidence here really just supported a chatty conversation with people who were there not to make the person submitting to the test panic. And that is the bottom line when you try to have the wrong witnesses make evidence. It doesn't necessarily destroy or undermine your case, although at times it can. It just doesn't do anything to bolster it. And my impression after having watched this video is inconclusive. It's not going to move the needle one way or the other. You didn't ask the right witnesses the right question, so it doesn't prove what you wanted to prove. And with that said, if you like my videos and you like my content, please be sure to like, share, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm. If you want to support the channel, the support links are either in the pinned comment or in the description, but above all else, support your community, support your friends, check to see if your neighbors need any help. I just dropped a bag of groceries off at my parents' place. I rang the doorbell and ran like a kid who just lit a bag of dog poo on fire. I mean, true, I don't necessarily need to ring the doorbell and run, but it just feels a little bit more adventurous to do that. So that's it. Stay safe, stay healthy, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah!
There's the guy who told me right there, National Guard guy, that it wasn't as bad as people are saying. He actually said it was overblown, some media hysteria. Again, these are the guys on the front lines of this, inside the tents, as they said, and they're saying it's not as bad as we're being told. They just said it was basically a worse version of the flu. Again, their words, not mine.